if you were to compare, for example, a typical source of protein on a plant-based diet like beans or tempeh versus an animal protein like red meat, it's also important to consider what else is in the package that is going to deliver you that protein, right? So it's like, yes, you can get protein both ways. They both be beneficial in like building muscle or just meeting your overall needs. But what are the things that, and I also want to kind of separate it here. What are the things within meat that you might not want in that package, right? Because most people are familiar with the industrialized factory farming meat, which is just not going to be good for anybody that's filled with all these antibiotics, GMOs, and, it's just, there's a lot of things that you don't want in that. But if you were to take regeneratively raised, like beef, something that doesn't have as many of those deleterious things, when you compare the two, what are some things that are still going to be detrimental to your system over the long term as well, right?
Mm. I primarily think about the differences in the effect of animal protein and plant protein sources on your blood lipids, and what does that do to your risk of cardiovascular disease. And you raise an interesting sort of point there about regenerative versus conventional, and this almost takes us into this territory of like ancestral eating. And this is super interesting because we know that saturated fat, which is mostly rich in animal foods. There are some plant foods like tropical oils like coconut or palm oil that are very high in saturated fat. But one of the benefits of a very plant-forward diet is unless you're kind of dumping a lot of coconut and palm oil in your food, it is naturally a low saturated fat sort of style of diet. Something that I find really interesting is there's quite a good amount of data looking at cholesterol levels, blood lipid levels in hunter-gatherer tribes. And Loren Cordain, who's like the father of the paleo diet, he published a paper, we can perhaps put in the show notes, that looked at the cholesterol levels, the typical cholesterol levels in hunter-gatherer tribes. And it's actually remarkably low. These are not people that are eating lots of saturated fat. So what does that tell you about the meat quality that they tend to eat? It's very lean. It's probably more akin to venison or antelope, wild game. It's different to many of the fatty cuts of meat that people are eating and sort of promoting on social media today. And in fact, Loren Cordain's position is that we shouldn't eat foods that are increasing our cholesterol levels. And I think this is you talk about the protein package. This is one of the downsides of animal protein, particularly if it's not lean sources of animal protein, is that it's going to increase LDL cholesterol, or more specifically, what now we would say is a better predictor, which is ApoB. And there's a bit of a rabbit hole, so I'm not sure if we want to go into that. But that's something that people can request when they do a blood test, and it's a very good predictor of atherosclerosis, the buildup of fatty plaque in the artery, which is responsible for most heart attacks and strokes. And we have clinical studies that compare red meat to white meat to plant protein, and they look at what happens to that blood biomarker. These are very controlled studies, and they're crossover studies. So each participant acts as their own control. You get an opportunity to do the plant protein part of the study. You switch to the white meat, red meat, and people do it in different orders, and we look at what happens to your blood chemistry. And you see red and white meat both significantly raise ApoB. Plant protein reduces it. So that's kind of one of the big benefits when you're swapping calories from animal protein for plant protein is you should start to shift ApoB in a favorable direction. Hopefully, if you get that down below 80 milligrams per deciliter and you're someone broadly that lives a healthy lifestyle and you haven't had a heart event before, your risk of cardiovascular disease is super low. And we see people who are blessed genetically, who are born with really low ApoB, they don't develop cardiovascular disease. It is the necessary component for atherosclerosis. Sure, there are other things like inflammation and high blood glucose that can kind of add fuel to the flame, but the necessary component, what initiates it, is elevation of ApoB. And when you shift calories from animal protein to plant protein, that's going to move into a favorable direction. The other part of this protein package sort of conversation is the exposure to fiber. When you're eating more legumes and beans and lentils and tempeh, you increase fiber in the diet, which has a number of different benefits. But if we're talking here about blood lipids, it helps to clear bile, right, from the body. And the reason that that's important, so bile is produced by the liver, it goes into the stomach, and in short, it helps us absorb fats in our food. That's what it's there for. And bile, the primary sort of constituent or ingredient of bile is cholesterol. When fiber helps pull that out of the natural response of the body is, hey, we need more bile. And so the liver has to make that bile. And to make that bile, it has to pull cholesterol out of the blood, lowering ApoB in the process, into the liver where it manufactures the bile. So that's the kind of mechanism by which fiber helps improve blood lipids through that sort of ApoB lowering route. So those are kind of two primary things. Animal foods also contain dietary cholesterol. Dietary cholesterol is a super controversial topic, and the evidence is actually really clear. I'm not sure why it's that controversial. It does not have anywhere near as much effect on ApoB as saturated fats do. It still does, but it's a much smaller effect. So if someone's wanting to really move ApoB into a favorable direction, they're much better off focusing on lowering saturated fat and, importantly, replacing it with polyunsaturated fats is super important.